The Woman in the First Row, Part 1. The Seat She Always Found. He had noticed it first when he was 24 years old, at his third tournament, when he was still in the period of losing more than he won, and the losses were the kind that left specific marks on the understanding rather than just on the record. She was in the fourth row that day. Not the first, because the first row was already taken by the time she arrived, and she had not arrived early enough because she was not yet accustomed to the need to arrive early. She was sitting with her coat folded on her lap, a small woman with dark hair and the particular quality of attention that she brought to everything, total, undivided, without the peripheral awareness that most people carry even in moments of supposed concentration. She was watching Chuck, and only Chuck, with the focused attention of someone who has come specifically for this and is not going to be distracted by the broader event around it. He lost that day, which he had been expecting to do, and which was still instructive in the way that expected things can still be instructive if you are paying the right kind of attention. After the match, making his way to the side of the floor, he had looked for her, and found her still in her seat, not moving toward him, not performing the parental gesture of rushing to the son who had lost. Just sitting, waiting, with the patience that was one of the most consistent things about her. He sat next to her. She put one hand on his arm and said, in the specific and practiced quietness she had developed for the transmission of important things, "You saw the third sequence too late. You'll know it the next time." She had identified the exact technical issue correctly in the kind of language that suggested she had been studying what she was watching with genuine analytical attention. His mother had never trained in a martial art. She had been to 11 of his tournaments. She had started coming without announcement. There had been no conversation about it, no arrangement. One day she had appeared at a tournament that he had not mentioned to her, sitting in the available row closest to the floor, and she had watched with that focused quality, and afterward had said a few words about what she had seen, and Chuck had understood, without discussion, that this was something she was going to do. She kept doing it for 10 years. By the time Chuck was in his early 30s and the championships had accumulated into a record that people in the sport use the word legendary about, Wilma Norris had been to more than 40 tournaments and had sat in the first row at 31 of them. The first row was not always available. Sometimes she arrived and it was already occupied by other early arrivers, or by officials, or by the designated front row seating that tournament venues reserved for judges and media. On those occasions, she sat in the second or the third. But when the first row was available, she took it. Chuck had learned to look for her before a match. Not for encouragement. He had moved past the developmental stage at which pre-match encouragement was a meaningful input. He looked for her because seeing her seated in the first row, with her coat on her lap and her total attention directed at the floor, was the specific confirmation that the event was real, that it was happening, that someone who had known him from before there was anything to know was present for it. Part 2. What she had carried. He knew her story in the way that children know their parents' stories, incompletely, with the specific gaps that are produced by what was not discussed at the dinner table, by what the parent chose to transmit versus what they chose to absorb alone. He knew the major facts: the Irish-American family in Oklahoma, the early marriage to his father, the 3 boys in rapid succession, the drinking that had started before Chuck was old enough to understand what it was, and that had defined the household's atmosphere for 16 years before his father finally left. He knew that she had worked throughout, not continuously, because the moves made continuity impossible, but without significant gaps. Waitress, laundry worker, factory work twice, a brief period of office filing that she had described once as the best-paying work she had ever done, and she had said it without bitterness, as a plain statement of economic fact. She had worked and raised 3 boys and moved 16 times and maintained, through all of this, a quality of steadiness that Chuck had understood early, before he had the language for it, was not simply a temperamental quality. It was a choice, made and remade daily, in the specific and unspectacular way that the important choices are made. He knew that she prayed. He had grown up with this, the particular silence of her bedroom in the early morning, the Bible on the nightstand that was the most consistent object in their inconsistent housing landscape, the specific quality of faith she carried that was not performative and not loud but was simply present, the way a load-bearing wall is present in a house. You don't see it doing its work. You understand its necessity by what collapses without it. He knew that she had buried Wieland and continued, that she had buried her first husband, Chuck's father, who died in 1970, the same year as Wieland, as though the family's capacity for loss had been allocated to that year in particular, and continued, that she had watched the thing she most feared, the thing she had prayed against specifically and consistently for the entire period of his childhood, happen to her son regardless of her prayers, and that she had understood this not as a failure of the prayer but as the kind of thing that happens inside a life that prayer does not exempt you from, only sustains you through. He knew these things in the way you know the structure of the house you grew up in, not by studying it, but by having lived inside it long enough that its dimensions are your dimensions. What he did not fully know until a Thursday afternoon in his 33rd year, when she appeared at the dojo unannounced and they sat in the office and talked for 3 hours, was the texture of what she had felt about his choices, not the approval or the pride, those he had always had, reliable as the first row, but the specific interior experience of watching her eldest son make the decisions he had made and not being able to guarantee the outcomes. Part 3. The Thursday afternoon. She arrived at the dojo at 2:15, during the break between the noon class and the 2:30. She had never come to the dojo without calling ahead, which was her method. She was precise about the social protocols that governed other people's time. The not calling was the first indication that this was different from an ordinary visit. She sat in the office chair across from the desk with her coat on her lap, the same posture as the first row, the coat folded neatly, and she looked at Chuck with the full version of her attention, the one she usually had to share with the logistical requirements of the moment she was in. "I've been thinking about something," she said, "and I've decided it's better to say it than to keep thinking it." Chuck waited. "When you were 23, she said, "and you told me you were going to open the karate school. Do you remember what I said?" He remembered. She had said, "Be careful with the money and call me if you need help." She had said it calmly, without enthusiasm but also without discouragement. He had interpreted it at the time as the supportive neutrality of a mother who trusted her son's judgment. He had told her so at the time, and she had not corrected him. "I was afraid," she said now. "I know," he said. "No," she said, "I mean I was more afraid than you understood. Not of the school failing. I thought the school might fail, and that would have been hard, but failure isn't the thing I was afraid of." She looked at her hands. "I was afraid you were going to do what your father did." Chuck was still. "Not in the same way," she said quickly. "Not the drinking, not the leaving, but the being somewhere that wasn't the right place for you, for reasons that seemed sensible, for years, until you'd lost the time for the other thing." She paused. "Your father was not a bad person. I've had 25 years to think about this, and I believe it more every year. He was a person who never found what he was supposed to do, and who filled the space of not having found it with things that didn't help." She was looking at him now with the full directness of someone who has been carrying something and is handing it over. "When you opened the school, I was afraid you were going to teach karate for 30 years and then discover that what you should have been doing was something else, and by then it would be too late." "Why didn't you say this at the time?" Chuck said. "Because it wasn't my life to decide," she said. You were 23 years old and you had a specific idea about what you wanted to do and the ability to do it. And because, she paused again, because I knew I might be wrong. The fear was mine. It wasn't necessarily information about your situation. She looked at the desk between them. I came today because I want to tell you something I haven't said out loud in the 10 years since you opened the school. Every time I've sat in that first row and watched you, I've been sitting there with two things happening at the same time. One of them was pride, which you probably know about. The other was relief, specific relief. The relief of someone who has been afraid of the wrong outcome for a long time and has been watching the right outcome accumulate year after year, proof by proof. She looked up. I was wrong to be afraid, or I was afraid of the wrong thing. You are exactly where you are supposed to be, and I've known it for years and I haven't said it. Part 4. What she noticed from the first row. She stayed for 3 hours. They talked in the way they talked when there was enough time, which was not always, the demands of his schedule being what they were, and the demands of her life being what they were, and the two of them being the kind of people who were competent at short interactions and did not always make the time for the longer ones. 3 hours was unusual. Chuck told Paulie through the office door that the 2:30 class was Paulie's and the 4 o'clock probably was too, and Paulie, who had met Wilma Norris many times and who understood the specific weight of the phrase "it's my mother," said without hesitation that he had them covered. She talked about the tournaments, about what she had noticed from the first row over the years, not the technical things which she had always relayed in the specific language of someone paying careful attention to a craft she had not studied but was studying in practice. The other things, the way he prepared, the pre-match quality of his attention, which she described as being like watching someone turn down the volume on everything except one specific signal. The way he interacted with the other competitors before and after, more interested in them than most people expected of a champion, asking about their training, their experience, remembering names from previous events. You do something that most of the men at those tournaments don't do, she said. You treat the people you've just beaten the same way you'd want to be treated if you'd lost. Not with false comfort. I've seen you be honest when someone asks why they lost and you tell them plainly, but without any performance of superiority. She paused. I've watched a lot of sporting events in my life. That quality is rarer than the winning. Chuck thought about this. He had not thought about it before as a conscious practice. It was simply the way he engaged with the tournament environment. He had come up losing, which meant he had spent years being on the other side of that interaction. The losing years made me better at that, he said. I know, she said. That's what I've been watching from the first row, not the winning, the person the losing built. She talked about the students. She had come to the dojo on several occasions when Chuck had not known she was coming, not to observe, she said, but to see the thing in its daily form rather than its presentational one. She described what she had watched, the patience he had with the beginners, which she said was the kind of patience that doesn't feel like patience from the inside, the kind that comes from genuine interest in the other person's learning rather than from a disciplined suppression of impatience. She described the moment she had watched him notice a student struggling with something and hold back the correction for 20 minutes, letting the student work through it, and then ask the right question at the moment the student was closest to understanding. Your father didn't have that, she said, not because he was incapable of it, because he never found the thing that made him want to give it. She looked at Chuck. You found it early, and you've been giving it consistently, and it has produced what it has produced. She gestured vaguely in the direction of the dojo floor. All of those people who walk out of that room different from how they came in. Part 5. The question she had not asked. Near the end of the 3 hours, she said, I want to ask you something I've wanted to ask for a long time and haven't. Ask it, he said. She looked at her hands for a moment. After Wieland, she said, in the period right after, you went back to competition almost immediately. Within a month. She paused. I watched you go back and I watched you compete, and you were very good, maybe better than you had been before. Some of the people at the tournament said you were sharper, that there was something different in your focus. She looked at him. I never asked what was happening inside that, because I was I was dealing with my own grief, and I wasn't sure I had room for yours as well, and I didn't want to take from you by asking you to give. She paused. I've regretted not asking. I'd like to ask now if it's something you can tell me. Chuck was quiet for a long moment. After Wieland died, he said slowly, I didn't know what to do with the training. For about 2 weeks, I came in at 5 and I stood in the room and there was nothing. The thing that normally starts when I start moving didn't start. It was like a disconnected circuit. He paused. Then I did something. I started thinking about Wieland when I trained, not as grief. I wasn't aware of it as grief, but I started running the forms with him in mind. Not performing for him, just having him present. The way he was always certain about things, the way he moved through the world. He looked at the desk, and the training changed. The circuit connected, but it connected differently than before. Not to the competition, not to the wins or the record. It connected to something underneath those, something that the wins had been resting on without my knowing they were resting on it. What was it resting on? She said. The belief that what I was doing mattered, he said. Not to the sport, not to the record, to the people around it. Wieland believed that. He believed it about me before I did, and after he died, the training became an act of carrying that belief forward, not demonstrating it, not performing it, carrying it. She looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said, in the tone she used when something confirmed something she had already understood but had needed to hear. You've always known that, he said. I've always seen it, she said. I haven't always known what to call it. Part 6. The first row. He drove her home at 5:30, which was the time the traffic on the 405 became the thing it became in the late afternoons of Southern California, unavoidable and slow and oddly companionable in its shared resignation. She sat in the passenger seat with her coat folded on her lap, looking at the traffic with the patience she brought to everything. At a red light on Crenshaw, she said, I want to tell you something about why I sit in the first row. He looked at her. When I was 12 years old, she said, my mother came to every school event I participated in, not because I was particularly talented, I wasn't, in the ways that get noticed. But she came, and she always sat in the front, and I asked her once why she didn't sit in the back where she could see everything better. She said, the front row is where you go when you want the person on the floor to know you're there. She paused. I thought about that a great deal when you started competing. I sat in the back the first 2 times. I was being considerate of the people behind me, I thought. And then I watched you and I understood what she meant. It wasn't about whether you could see me. It was about being in the position that says, I am here completely for this. She looked at the light. The front row is a statement. It says I am not watching from a distance. I am as close as the event allows. The light changed. Chuck drove. You've been in the first row for 10 years, he said. You've been on the floor for 10 years, she said. That seemed like the right response. They drove the rest of the way in the particular quiet of 2 people who have said the essential things and are now simply being together in the aftermath of saying them, which is its own kind of communication. The silence that is not empty but full, that holds what was said the way a room holds the warmth after the fire has been banked, gently and without loss. He walked her to her door. She hugged him with the particular quality of a small person hugging someone larger. Not clinging, not performing, simply the full fact of the embrace, present and brief and complete. I'll be there Saturday, she said. the tournament on Saturday. "I know," he said. "First row," she said. "I know," he said again. He drove home along the 405 in the slowing evening light, thinking about the first row and about what it meant to show up completely for something. Not as a gesture, not as a duty, but as the expression of a particular quality of care that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to, that simply occupies the closest available position and stays there, present and attentive, for as long as the event requires. He had built his practice on this principle without knowing it was a principle. The 5 o'clock mornings, the full attention in every class, the specific quality of engagement he brought to each student's learning, these were all versions of the same thing his mother had been demonstrating from the first row for 10 years. He had learned it from her, she had learned it from her mother. These things pass forward from the people who show us what full presence looks like before we have a name for it. Epilogue: 41 tournaments. Wilma Norris attended 41 of Chuck's tournaments in the years between 1965 and 1974. This is a fictional accounting based on the spirit of what is known, that she was present for the significant chapters of his career, that she was the kind of mother who showed up, and that showing up was her most consistent and defining characteristic. Of the 41 tournaments, she sat in the first row at 32. At the other 9, she took what was available. She never missed a competition in which Chuck held the championship. She was there every year from 1968 through 1974, the 6 consecutive defenses, the streak that the sport still talks about in the language of improbability. She sat in the first row for each of those championship defenses. She folded her coat on her lap. She watched with the attention that she brought to everything her children did, which was total and undivided and unperformed. When Chuck retired from competition in 1974, undefeated at the age of 34, she was there. First row, coat on lap. Watching the last match of a career that had begun with losses and had ended without them, watching it the same way she had watched the first match and every match between, completely, from as close as the event would allow. He looked for her before the final match, as he always did. He found her. She raised one hand, slightly, in the specific gesture that meant, "I am here, I see you, I am exactly where I intend to be." He nodded. He stepped onto the floor. He competed. Some things don't need to be more complicated than that.